I can help you with that.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so my name is Charlotte. I'm the Conservation and Policy Campaigner for the Wilderness Committee. I work on Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories, and also in so-called Vancouver. If any of you have visited here, you may have noticed that BC is bursting with life. The diversity and abundance here is pretty incredible, more biodiversity than any other province or territory in Canada. But the diversity and abundance here today is a small fraction of what was once here before Europeans stepped foot on these lands. Colonialism and capitalism have both stressed this land and the species, to say the very least, and the extractive resource economy that we find ourselves in right now hasn't been around that long, but it's been devastating for wildlife, wilderness, and the Indigenous peoples that belong to these lands. So if we just imagine a little bit going back in time, we'd only have to rewind the clock about 60 years to see when large-scale fossil fuels, clear-cut, and mining really began impacting wildlife across the country. The early 1900s is when industrial whaling drove many species to near extinction. And then back another 50 years from that is when giant trees in BC, some of the largest on Earth, begin to fall on an industrial scale. So I think acknowledging these systems is essential in the fight to save wildlife, because systems existed here before Europeans that respected wildlife and allowed for mutual flourishing. And I like to remind myself of this because I do believe that systems can change and we can find other ways of living that is more respectful. And so with that, I guess I'll just touch, I mean, you did a great job of explaining what some of my work does, but yeah, so I focus on protecting wildlife and especially those that are at risk of extinction. I'll be talking today about, actually, I'll just go to my next slide. Yeah, so here's a bit of an outline. So we'll talk about what species at risk are, just in case we can get everyone up to the same page. And then we'll talk about the Federal Species at Risk Act and how it applies to marine species at risk. We'll examine some failures of the law, and then we'll get into some solutions. Okay, so this is also just a little snapshot of what's kind of going on in Canada wildlife-wise. From 1970, this is kind of what I talked about roughly 50 years ago, till 2014, half of monitored wildlife species in Canada declined in abundance. You can see it sort of breaking down in the different groups. Grassland birds have been hit the hardest. Yeah, just a little bit of an image there to help. Okay, so what are species at risk? I'm sure many of you are like, okay, I know this, but I thought I'd just cover it really quickly in case. So species at risk are endangered of disappearing from the wild or in a geographic area. So there's an example, let's say the spotted owl. We have one known breeding pair left in Canada, but there's a population that's relatively stable in the United States. So this species would be at risk in Canada. And so we also have COSEWIC, which is the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, and they are the advisory panel responsible for listing species at risk and determining what level of threat they are at. So COSEWIC will basically receive an application and review a species and then designate it as extinct, extirpated, endangered, threatened, special concern, not at risk, or data deficient. I just want to say briefly that COSEWIC is an amazing agency. They're science-based, full of experts that some of them I know, and it's incredibly tough work and they do a really good job. So I just want to shout out to them and everyone working for COSEWIC or who has. Okay, so this is the board that figures out the status of a species. Now, it's important to know that COSEWIC status does not mean that the animal is legally protected. For a species at risk to be legally protected, there is another step, and the recommendation COSEWIC makes would go to the federal minister and then the governor and council to legally list it under federal law. So COSUIC more so makes a recommendation. I think we mostly probably know what these terms mean. I don't know if I need to break it down. I'll go through a couple just in case. Extirpated means a species that no longer exists in the wild in Canada, but occurs elsewhere, or like a population of a species. So we could say Southern mountain caribou, there's specific herds and local populations that have gone extinct locally. So they would be extirpated locally, but there's other herds surviving in the rest of BC and Alberta. And then data deficient is a category when there's just not enough scientific information to make a determination on a species at risk. Okay, so I thought we could go through some of the known marine species, hopefully known, and try to figure out what status they are. So I don't know, maybe think in your mind or drop it in the chat if you want to guess the status. So I'm not sure who's heard of southern resident killer whales, but let me know what status you think they are. We got one for endangered, endangered. Cool, cool. All right, seems like everyone kind of knows what they're talking about here. Yes, so they are COSUIC listed as endangered, and as well, Sarah has legally listed them. So they are legally listed under the federal law as endangered. Okay, Atlantic white-sided dolphin. And it can be any one of the categories I mentioned above. Any ideas on this one? Okay. They are not at risk. Sometimes you got to offer the good pieces of information also. So these ones are not at risk. Hooray. Hopefully it stays that way. Okay, the American eel. Any ideas on the American eel? At risk? What level of at risk? They are at risk. You can just drop it in the chat if you think you know. Okay, they are threatened. So COSUIC has found them to be threatened. Now, interestingly, Sarah, the federal law, has them as no status. So you can see there's a discrepancy there. So make a note of that. Sea otter, possibly cutest animal to exist. Any ideas on sea otter? Not at risk. Extirpated. Interesting. This one's interesting for sure. Okay. So COSUIC has listed them as special concern, and Sarah has accepted this recommendation, and they are legally listed as special concern. Exactly, Sydney. So in the late 1700s, with the European maritime fur trade, this species was pushed to extinction in Canada. They were lost from the land. They were brought back in the 1970s, sourced from populations in Alaska, and it's been largely successful. So I think, again, we focus so much on the negative, and I think it's so important to highlight the stories of success and remember what can happen when wildlife have habitat. We can definitely save species. They want to survive. And they're very resilient if given a chance. Okay, the North Atlantic and Pacific right whale. Endangered, yeah. So COSUIC has listed them as endangered, and same with Sarah. Yep. Now these whales were almost driven to extinction in the 19th century from commercial whaling. Fishing nets have now become a very big threat to them. Okay, so enough of that. Let's dive into the species at risk law. This is a warning. This presentation is pretty in the weeds, like legally. So I'm going to do my best to explain it because I think it is really valuable to understand how this law works and doesn't work. So the Federal Species at Risk Act is the legal law that we have to protect species at risk in Canada. Schedule 1 is the legal list. That's what I was talking about. Once COSEWIC recommends the listing, it then gets sent to the federal government, who will decide whether to put it onto Schedule 1, where it will be legally protected. Under SARA, it's an offense to kill, harm, harass, capture, take, possess, collect, buy, sell, or trade any individual listed on Schedule 1 of endangered, threatened, or extirpated. Interesting to note that special concern species don't receive these protections. As well, it is an offense to damage or destroy the residence of a species listed under Schedule 1 as endangered, threatened, or extirpated. Okay, so you can't kill a species at risk, and you have to protect their habitat. It sounds amazing, right? Sounds like this would be a pretty good law. Unfortunately, the law is full of loopholes. So many species at risk are actually not protected from being harmed or having their habitat destroyed. So let's dive into some of the loopholes in the law. Okay, loophole number 1 is it only automatically applies to federal land, aquatic species, and migratory birds. So for species at risk that are land-based, protection depends on where they're located. Any species that is on non-federal land are not automatically protected. Federal land is things like airports, post offices, military bases, and national parks. In Canada, that's 59, or in Canada, non-federal land is 59% of the land base, and in BC, it's 94% of the land base. So if you're a species at risk located in non-federal land, you don't receive automatic protection from being harmed or having your habitat destroyed. Protection measures can be triggered, but it's up to the province essentially to have the responsibility first to do that. And when they fail, which they most often do, the federal government is supposed to step in with emergency protections, but they very rarely do this, and they've only actually done that twice. So you can see that this is a huge loophole. Literally, if you're a land-based species on 94% of the land in BC, you are not automatically protected under the law. This is a really good example that kind of paints a picture of like how this plays out in reality. So on federal land in national parks, the whitebark pine, which is endangered, is protected. Lake Louise was fined $2 million for cutting down 38 whitebark pine trees because they're located within a national park. But if we just jump over to BC, it is entirely legal for logging companies to be cutting down whitebark pine trees on non-federal land, and they do. This is a Narwhal article, I think it came out last year, that shows that BC is allowing logging and mining companies to cut down thousands of endangered trees. I hope that this is all making sense so far. I will take questions at the end though. So let's shift focus on marine species, which is why you're all here. You might be thinking that this is a good thing because marine species are federal jurisdiction, but many species, unfortunately, that are marine-based still don't get the protection they deserve. Atlantic cod is a great example of sort of a failure of SARA. So SARA-listed species receive automatic protection from being harmed or having their residence destroyed. Strong protections, right? And so COSEWIC has found cod to be endangered under SARA, endangered. But under SARA, they have no assigned risk status, despite having lost 99% of their population since the 1960s. So can anyone guess why the government has been reluctant to list cod? You could just drop this in the chat. So for marine species at risk, because they're automatically protected, it means that if they are legally listed, they'd be protected from being killed or having their habitat destroyed. So free trade agreements, interesting, potentially. But yeah, it all loops into specifically fish species that are important for commercial harvests do not get listed. Yeah, exactly. Pacific salmon is a perfect example as well. We'll get into more examples of why this is happening. So it is largely based on the economy. Okay, so here's an example kind of how the listing of a species works. I don't know if you can see my pointer. I don't think so. Okay, so first, species are assessed by COSEWIC. Their assessment gets set to the federal minister, who has a certain amount of time, I believe 90 days, to recommend to governor and council whether to list or not list the species. Then governor and council cabinet, the federal cabinet, they're the ones that get to decide, do we list this species or do we not? Do we say that, cod is actually too important to commercial harvest fishing, so we're going to decline to list the species? They're allowed to consider socioeconomics at this point. It's definitely not entirely science-based. They allow economic considerations. So this leads me to two more loopholes. So Stephen Harper found vague wording in the law, and it allowed their government to avoid making decisions altogether in regards to species listing. Loophole number 3, federal cabinet can decide not to list the species based on socioeconomics, but at least they're required to decide, which holds them accountable in the slightest bit, I guess. Okay, so here is where the loopholes exist. So the minister, once they receive the file, they have that there is a loophole here where basically, if they never pass the file on to the governor and council, these files will sit in legal limbo forever. And that's exactly what has happened. So 90% of the files that came to Stephen Harper, his government, never got So which species do you think are held in the... Okay, sorry. Yeah, we have all of the species that are important for commercial harvest. So studies show that Sera species are less likely to be listed as threatened or endangered if they are the target of commercial harvest. The most obvious is the Atlantic cod. From my quick research making this presentation, 172 at-risk marine of the 172 at-risk marine species, 116 of them have no legal status. So that's 67% of marine species at risk are not listed legally. And the more endangered the fish, the less likely of it being listed. From 2003 to 2015, only 12 fish species have been listed under SARA, including just 3 endangered and 2 threatened species. I made this graphic in 2018. It just shows which species fall through these loopholes the most. So again, COSEWIC has found, so these are species COSEWIC has found to be at risk, but are not added legally. So 83% of marine fish, 34 freshwater, mammals are next. And then, when you get to the animals that have smaller implications on, the resource economy, they're more likely to be listed. So, 95% of amphibians that are found to be at risk by COSEWIC get added to the legal listing under SARA. So here's a bit of a case study. This is an example of SARA playing through in its fullest, even when, all the things happen and a species does make it onto the legal list, they aren't necessarily protected. So I don't know if you guys have heard of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, but it's an expansion on an existing shipment. And basically, it's the route for these tankers are going through the critical habitat of the southern resident killer whales. So southern resident killer whales as we discussed, are endangered and they're legally listed under SARA. They have their habitat mapped and they have a recovery strategy. They're marine species, so federal jurisdiction, so federal SARA automatically applies. In the Canadian Environmental Impact Assessment, TMX was found to have significant adverse effects on southern resident killer whales. And this is kind of the example of, this is the finding that should trigger like, oh, this project is bad. Like, this is the finding that you don't want to have for species at risk. Like, it's the worst finding. It means there's irreversible harm that will happen to an already endangered species. And, conceptually, that should be enough to can the project or have it reworked in a way where it doesn't do this amount of harm. Under species at risk, that is a violation to cause significant adverse effects to a species. And so this went then to cabinet to determine if the impacts were justified. And all cabinet had to say is, yeah, the impacts to the whales are justified. So we can see the weaknesses built into the law when, throughout the entire process from listing to deciding on a species, we're constantly allowing for that economic input to dilute what should be a law to protect species. So what is the solution? This is an interesting conversation. I've talked to many people about this. Some people say we need a complete SARA overhaul. We need to change the law, fix it. And then some people say, if we do that, we risk gutting it and making it even worse. I believe that the species at risk law can be very strong if it's followed in the way it's supposed to be. The species at risk law really is as strong as the government in power. The minister does have a lot of discretion and cabinet does have a lot of discretion, but we vote ministers in, well, MPs, we vote those people into power and we can vote them out of power. So there is a level of accountability there if we all start paying more attention. I believe that all provinces and territories should enact standalone laws that protect species at risk that fall through the cracks. In BC, we're pushing for the BC government to create a standalone law that would protect species that are land-based throughout the 94% where they're not automatically protected. And ultimately, species need time and space to recover. Sometimes that does require sacrifice in the short term to save a species in the long term. And in the case of the Atlantic cod, if we had stronger regulations on harvest and gave them time to recover before things got so bad, maybe they never would have collapsed in the way they did. Then I'll just bring it back to my work at Wilderness Committee. So this is what we do. We keep track of species at risk progress, and we pressure ministers and cabinet at key moments in the timelines I showed you. During consultations, we are effective at getting hundreds of people to write in when usually there are none. And when you get that kind of feedback, it definitely makes an impact on the cabinet and the ministers to recommend the right thing. And we also work to strengthen provincial laws, like I said, in Ontario and in BC and Manitoba as well. So if you'd like to join us, I believe that we are in a crisis just as severe as the climate crisis. I think the biodiversity crisis does not get the attention it deserves. It's on the back burner. You rarely hear governments talk about it, but they are linked. The climate crisis and biodiversity crisis is linked. And I think that we need to make this as urgent as the climate crisis for governments to start to really take action. So that's kind of what my work at Wilderness Committee is. And so if you feel like being a part of this movement, you can sign up and you can get emails from me. And we can do some of the things I talked about. We also do other fun things like trail building and host a ton of community events. If you're not an email person, but still want to help, you can follow me on social media. I post a lot of our actions and a lot of updates from the biodiversity world, I guess, so to speak. So you can follow me there. And then, here's some of the content you might get if you follow me. This guy, just fallen. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening. That is it, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Charlotte. Jason seems to have a question.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jason. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you for that. Great presentation. Uh, Myself, I'm a Inuit climate activist from Labrador. I used to work in the federal government for 7 years as a manager for contamination on reserves. And we had an intersection with species at risk because of toxic waste dumping and stuff like that.
Mhm.
And yeah, the economic argument wins out every time because that's the way the systems are torqued towards capitalism. So myself, as an Inuk, I always found it fascinating how European capitalism disseminates nature into its commodifiable parts as part of the system that people maintain. Because ecology at risk is where we're at, not just species at risk. Because by the time you get to a species at risk, even taking away the economic argument, you've already reached the near endpoint to devastation. Whereas if you protect the ecology at whole, along with the surrounding species that are adjacent to one that may be in more danger than another or risk, then you create the more holistic connection to nature that we as human animals are just a species thereof. So in that sort of viewpoint and background and lived experience, with respect to your organization and your solutions advocacy, what do you see as your ultimate solution to resolving this? Because, for example, reforming SARA and even SEPA is more of a distraction, if anything, to being incremental as a solution versus a holistic solution that's as grand in scale as the challenge before us, which of course is holistic climate change. So yeah, what is your ultimate solution to fixing these things where species at risk is just one symptom to a greater causation to these issues?
Thank you so much for that. And I want to say that I like entirely agree with what you're saying. Like protecting species at risk is definitely once they've moved into the emergency room. And I didn't get into how to prevent species from becoming at risk in the first place. But I believe there's multiple things we need. It is an actual cultural shift into what we value and how we prioritize things and how we make decisions. And who makes decisions? I'd like to see First Nation leadership be making, co-managing and co-governing on decisions that impact species at risk and native ecosystems. And I'd like to see proportions of native ecosystems automatically protected. That would deal with the cause of species decline. Your question is, if I had the answer, I think we would be there. It is a cultural shift. It's a shift in our system of capitalism. Every problem that I run into at my work, once I dive deep enough, it filters down to capitalism born out of colonialism. And so I know that's an intense thing to say. Sometimes we're just getting used to saying that. But it is the truth. That's what I found. And so when we say change the system, you need to consider who has power in the current system, how can we redistribute power, and then who decisions are made for. Whether we do that from the current colonial government system, I don't know. But I think in the meantime, I think we are seeing a big cultural change. We're seeing a big push to valuing other things over money, at least definitely in the public, not so much the government yet. But in the meantime, we need to grab onto the species that we can, because and I think legal protection is one way to do that. Same with, no-go marine protected areas too. So hopefully that helped answer that question. That was a tough question, I'm not gonna lie.
Just quickly to say thank you for that. Truth and facts are the basis of all rational thought. Avoiding the elephant in the room is sort of what maintains the status quo. And that only leads to things getting worse as a trend. So I believe what you're saying without saying it is you look forward to a new political party being started up that centers people and the planet above everything else. And I'm working on that. So
Oh, there you go.
maybe we'll
Awesome.
see you in the future.
Okay, cool.
But thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else have a question that they would like to ask Charlotte? You can put it in the chat or unmute like Jason. Otherwise, I do have a question for you, Charlotte. And I may have cut out during this period of the presentation, which was unfortunate. But you did mention loopholes of species being stuck essentially on the desks of in bureaucracy. And I was wondering if you had a specific number of species that were are currently in limbo and not being pushed through Sarah.
Yes, I just looked at this yesterday and I did a quick little stat capture. Where is it? Here. So what I did is I looked at I only did this for the marine species, so species in the Arctic, Pacific, and Atlantic Oceans. So of the 172 species that were listed as threatened, endangered, or special concern by COSEWIC, 116 of them have no legal status. So that's 67%. In terms of whether or not that's due to declining of listing or they're just sitting in that kind of legal limbo, I didn't dive into that. But essentially, like if you think of all of the Pacific salmon species, Chinook, sockeye, chum, like all of these species are like sitting in that limbo. I know that for sure because the government just does not want to decide. So yeah. And it was crazy because this was born out of Harper. Like he literally hired lawyers to be like, look at this law. How can we avoid action on it? Pretty crazy. I don't have any stats on the effects and risks of climate change on current and approaching, well, species at risk. I mean, as we know, especially for land-based species, like they're migrating north or up. And so we need to be thinking about where their new habitat will be with climate change. And like salmon are finding new streams and rivers that are less impacted by climate change. It changes everything. It means we have to think so much bigger and smarter about how these species are going to react and where they will go. Like I said, species are incredibly resilient and they want to survive. So we need to try to help them along in doing that. And I think they'll actually tell us what they need if we listen. Yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions? If not, we can look to end the webinar. Is there a way to get orphans? Oh,
definitely. So this is sitting with the minister, the federal minister of environment. Like all of these files are just sitting backlogged on their desk, for lack of a better word, I guess. So, any pressure to the minister to start going through and actually passing off those files to cabinet that's exactly where they're stuck. And if we can pressure them to start going through that backlog, that is very helpful. The Liberal government has said that they're working on it. I do believe they're doing better than Harper. They're not actively trying to not do stuff, but we just need more people on this. Like they always say capacity is an issue. And I'm like, we need to prioritize where we're putting people then, because the biodiversity crisis should be very high on our list of things to put time and money into. So, but yeah, cabinet and the federal minister of environment is where you'd want to pressure. I think that may be it.
Yeah, looks like it.
Cool.
Well, thank you so much, Charlotte, for the presentation. I think we all learned a lot today, and thank you to the audience for your questions and comments. I hope that you all enjoyed today's webinar, and we hope to see you again soon. Happy Early World Oceans Day, and have a great week, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.